Bugler, how did you meet Thomas Hardy?
I met Thomas Hardy at a rehearsal of the Woodlanders in 1913. I had been acting in the usual school play, and a man who was stage manager for the Hardy plays happened to lend some scenery to the school for a scene from As You Like It. I had been away to another school, had diphtheria, was convalescing and so on, and they were short of senior pupils at the school, and they asked me if I would play Adam in As You Like It. Well, I was 16-ish then, but Mr. Tilley, having thought if I could cope with Adam with his 80 years and 10, and I was that age, that perhaps I might be able to act, you see. And the next day he came to my home and said the Hardy players were doing the Woodlanders, and they were looking for a young girl to play Marty South. Would I be interested? And of course I was, and I said yes. And after she'd gone, I raced up the street and bought a copy of the Woodlanders, because I didn't know. I knew Hardy lived near us, and I knew of the Hardy plays, you see, and of course I was interested because I'd always liked acting, as I think most girls do, and that was that. He happened to come to a rehearsal, which he did through all the Hardy plays. He would come for several rehearsals, and then more as the years went by. Of course, there was the First World War. And anyhow, we were rehearsing, and he came in. One of the other players sitting by me said, would you know your lines, Marty? And I said, yes, I know them. I'm a bit puzzled about Marty's lament at the end, whether I should raise my arms or not when I say certain words. And he said, well, we'll go and ask Mr. Hardy. And Mr. Hardy, of course, was sitting across the room, so we went over, and he said, well, Marty, how'd you like your part? And I said, I loved it, but I was puzzled about these words. So he smiled and looked at me and then said, you'll know what to do when the time comes. And that was all the help I had, you see. I went back to my place and it was that. But that was actually when I met him first, or talked with him. That was in 1913, a long time ago.
What did you think of him when you met him first?
Well, of course I knew he was famous then, and I knew he'd written the plays and so on. Just quiet, smiling old gentleman, to me.
When did you meet him after that? Did you see quite a lot of him?
Well, he would come to several rehearsals. Then we mostly rehearsing, but we would break every now and again and chat. For instance, that was when one of the players said, where does the house of Giles Winterbourne, sir, could you tell us where that is? And he said if I'd known there'd been so much interest in where places were at the time I was writing, I would have been more careful, but I don't know where it is. So,
Now, you went on to play quite a lot of parts of Hardy's novels.
Yes. Well, at that time, the time we played, he had not married his second wife. The first wife died in 1912. And then we played the Woodlanders in 1913. That would have been November 1913. Well, then I believe it was February 1914 that they were married. But they'd only been married a few weeks when Mrs. Hardy came to my home in Dorchester, of course, and said the play had been a success and they were pleased on that, and that her husband thought I had talent. Had I ever thought of taking it up as a profession? Well, I hadn't. I was happy enough. It was wonderful to me to be a Hardy player and to have that part. Although it was not the leading part, it became the leading part because Marty's Marty, and of course that was the way it was. And then she wondered if my parents would object. Well, a question had never been raised, but I imagine they wouldn't. Then she said James Barry, he was not Sir James then, he was just J.M. Barry, was coming to Max Gate, and would I learn, first of all, did I know any of her husband's poems? It so happened that I had bought Times Laughing Stocks, which was published about that time, and I had learned to tramp Woman's Tragedy. So I told her that, and she said, "Oh, I think that's too long. I'll bring you some poems, and you learn them, and when Mr. Barry comes, he knows so much more about the theatre than we do. Perhaps you could have some training." And it was left at that. But you see, that was 1914. And then I didn't know if Barry ever came, but the war came, and that put an end to plays till 1916.
So you didn't have very much contact with Thomas Hardy once the war broke out?
As the years went by, the parts were bigger, and then we knew that he wanted Tess. In fact, after the Return of the Native had been played, and I played Eustacia in that part, he offered Mr. Tilley, who was our stage manager and generally ran the Hardy plays, he offered him his own dramatization of Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Mr. Tilley was a man of integrity and a churchman, mayor of Dorchester, and so on, said he couldn't put Tess on because Dorchester wouldn't take Tess then, because they perhaps would not see it as Hardy himself had, as Tess, the story of a pure woman. So I think he had an awkward time for a while because he felt that way, but he couldn't quite say that to Mr. Hardy, although they were friends. And somehow or another it was put off for 4 years, and then eventually played. By that time I was married, and I'd thought the Hardy plays were behind me and all that sort of thing. But Mr. Tilley came down and said, could I play the part? Well, baby was 6 months old, and she wasn't bottle fed. I lived in Beminster. The rehearsals were in Dorchester. There was one bus a day, and that was a little one from Beminster to Bridport. Because believe it or not, there was a railway there then, which went down from Maiden Newton to West Bay. So I would have to take train to Bridport and go to Maiden Newton, where you had to wait sometimes quite a time for the London train to come down. And then to Dorchester, and there Granny took charge of baby, and I was able to rehearse. And of course I didn't attend all the rehearsals, my sister read in my part for some of them, but I attended quite a lot. And of course, as that was Hardy's own dramatisation, he came more often to the rehearsals, and we saw more of him. And he was a great help because he knew music. He was an artist, of course, and nobody else could have done as he did, and he was extremely interested. And it was a success. And that was that.
What did he think of your performance of Tess?
He never told me. I can tell you if you looked in a book.
Did you want a book?
I know this, that Mr. Tilley, when he came down to ask me to play, came back. He'd said goodbye. I'd said I would do so. Then he came back and said, Marty, if you couldn't take that part, there wouldn't have been Tess, because the old man wouldn't let anybody else play it. The old man being T.H., of course.
So he obviously thought very highly of your skills as an actress.
He'd spoken of it before. There was a party at Max Gate for a Christmas party in 1920 when we, that is, the mummers play From the Return of the Native, and as you say, Shavai, I took the part of the Turkish knight in that. And we went out to Max Gate in our uniforms. Also did the singers who had taken part in the Mellstall Choir, which was an adaptation of Under the Greenwood Tree. And for that, in 1910, Hardy had looked out the old carols in the Bockhampton books, choir books and so on, of course, which he and his father and grandfather before him had used, and he'd allowed them to use those hymns, you see, or rather carols. I said hymns, but carols. So the singers and the mummers, as it were, went out to Max Gate. There was old Grandfather William playing a fiddle, as they would have done, you see, and a lantern on a pole. We crept up the drive. And then the singers sang the carols. And then Mr. and Mrs. Hardy came to the door and said, come in, which we did, and performed the play, the Mummers' play of St. George, you see. They are rather cramped for all of us, you see. He had been interested in that, and although he gives some description of it in his novel, he remembered, he said, or imagined, because there's no script of the play, they're passed down from generation to generation, you see, as old as that. But he had, I think, used his own words to complete the play as far as he could remember, because he said he couldn't remember the whole of it. There was no written word or anything. But he came to rehearsals, for instance, for that, and he was so helpful. We just had the words of the Mummers' play, and as we were singing, as we were just saying, well, a mumming, we will go, just the words as we'd given them in our part books, you see. He said, don't you think it would improve it if you sort of hummed a tune or something like that as you marched in and out? Of course, that's just what was wanted. So somebody said, well, what are you thinking of, sir? What sort of tune do you suggest? And he said, oh, anything. La 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 la. Because really in hunting we will go, you see, it fitted in. And that was that. And then we would come to the part in the Mummers play where they killed each other and everybody's dead lying on the stage. And the doctor comes in with a bottle of alicampane and he puts a drop to each man's heart. Well, after they were dead, you see, it was rather difficult to get up from a flat floor and that sort of thing. But again, we just had the words of our parts and we'd use them. And he said, well, do you think if you sort of chanted something like that, when the doctor's given them the drops, wouldn't it be easier if you just, rather than just rise in silence, chant or something like that? So again, somebody said, well, what do you suggest, sir? The one he suggested was Tess's favourite chant, which is Langdon in F. And later on, just before the play was produced, at a rehearsal, the local band, Frampton Family Band, were rehearsing. I had done my part and came off the stage and back into the hall of the Corn Exchange at Dorchester, you see. And Thomas Hardy was sitting in front row. It was one of the very much later rehearsals, you see. It was where we were going to play. And I made to pass, you see. I wouldn't think of sitting myself down by Thomas Hardy. But anyhow, he saw me and pointed to the chair next to me, you see. So I did as I was told and sat there, hardly knowing what to say, but as I did say, oh, that music is perfect, isn't it, just there? And the curtain came down after the quarrel scene between, well, when Angel makes a certain confession and Tess is the same, but one law for a man, another for a woman. And Hardy had decreed that this chant, the music for the chant, should be played as the curtain dropped, you see, and it was perfect. He was always perfect, he just knew. And I just said, I think that's perfect there. And he said, well, just casually, well, you know what it is, don't you? It's Langdon in F. And I said, no, I don't know what it is. My people are nonconformists. I just don't know anything about church music. He said, oh, Tess, you should have it. I'll make a copy and send it. I thought no more about it, but I've got the copy. And we did, of course, use that as he had suggested. And I rather think it must have been a favourite chant of his too, because the tune or chant he chose just to hum the music of it for the mummers as they came back to life, as it were, was that one. And then he writes of it in the book. That came to him as he hummed it to us. I've just got an idea that might have been his favourite chant too.
What sort of man do you think Hardy was? What sort of man do you think Hardy was?
What do you mean, what sort of man?
What was his character like?
You knew him as quiet. Used to see him often because we lived in South Street, Dorchester, and he belonged to the Historical and Archaeological Society at Dorchester, at the museum, I think it was then, and is now. And we would see him walking up through the South Street, you see, to attend a meeting, or look up something there. I can only say just a quiet man, and he could smile and he could laugh, in spite of all the things that were written about him in those days. He was a pessimist, and he knew that too. And he wasn't a pessimist. I always said he wasn't a pessimist. He's a realist. And I've lived long enough to know that I'm right as far as that goes. Things can happen so much to one person. I've heard it said, well, everything couldn't go against Tess or so on. But it can happen in real life. So I always defend him wherever I get a chance and say he wasn't a pessimist. Because we saw quite a lot of him, you see, really, over the years. For myself, from 1913 to 24. Not every minute, but we did the Wessex scenes from the Dynasts, for instance, in 1916, which was about the local people and the way they viewed the fact that Napoleon might invade us. And we were 100 years away from that, and we were waiting for Kaiser Bill to come our way at that time. In fact, he wrote some words for those scenes. I don't think they've ever been published, but that's by the way. Quiet, and he could laugh, yes. And they knew so much about people in Dorchester. Of course, he had lived in Dorchester so long, and the Hardy place had been running a long time, and there were people, you see, he was educated mostly in Dorchester. He was bound to know the families and the people there more or less, or people he'd meet.
Did you become quite good friends with him and Mrs. Hardy?
Did I?
Did you become quite good friends with him and Mrs. Hardy?
He said, but it's such a long story. The last time I saw him, when, as far as I knew, I should be seeing a lot more of them, but that was not to be. He did say then, at that time, you see, it was arranged that I should go to London, to the Theatre Royal, Haymarket, to play Tess there. Lionel Barrymore, the great American actor, was going to do a season of Hamlet. And it was fixed, I think, whether it was 6 or 8 years, I can't remember. But Mr. Harrison, who was lessee of the theatre then, had come to Dorchester and saw the last night of Tess, and then rather like a storybook, a message came round to the dressing rooms from Mrs. Hardy. Someone wanted to meet me. Would I go to the front of the stage as soon as we were dressed? And so I went round. And as I said, it was like a storybook. People must believe it or not. Well, they've got to believe it because there are letters to prove it, so that's he just said, I've seen your performance of Tess tonight. Will you come to London and play it for me? Well, it just could knock me down with a feather, as the saying goes. I could hardly take it in. But I said yes, without much thought, you see. Well, then there were arrangements to be made. Some alterations were to be made to the play. For instance, some parts, Sir John d'Urberville, for instance, used the dialect And as Mr. Harrison said, London people, you see, would find that another language. So Hardy altered that. Then he added some extra lines for Tess. Mr. Harrison asked for them, you see. And then I was asked to go out to Maxgate to lunch as Mr. Harrison was coming down, and the alterations would be made, and they wanted me to read them or see them, you see, which we did. I read the new part. Mr. Hardy read the new parts that he'd put in for the man, you see, and that sort of thing, and chatted about this, that, and the other. And I was to have gone to London just 3 weeks after that to play. That was on the Friday. I was beginning to wonder what on earth I'd done, you see. But I have to leave, and the baby and the rest of it. Then Mrs. Hardy herself came down to our cottage here in Bedminster. He was very agitated. She sent a wire first. Then came, the first word she said was, "My husband doesn't know that I'm here." And I wondered what on earth she was going to say or thinking about. I mean, I was astonished. Everything was fixed. And then she said, "You mustn't go to London." So whether I answered or not, I don't know. And I said, "How can I not? Everything is fixed." And so, no, we must make some excuse. And somewhere I'd said to her something about going, you see, that I wasn't sure that I was doing the right thing with the baby and so on. And she said, "Oh, well, other actresses have baby. You can get a nurse and we'll find a job for your husband." That was that. And then this was complete change. And she said her husband was in a very nervous state. So was she. He didn't know she was there, but I mustn't go. It would ruin his reputation. And he was an old man, and I just mustn't go. I can't remember all she said, because by that time I was frightened. I was really frightened, because she was so agitated. And then she said, "He's writing a poem to you. You're going away together. You're going to Tollerdale. You're going along the Crooked Road," and so on. I don't know that I took it all in. I mean, I was so absolutely scared. It was so opposite to everything. And having said that, and she said, "Blackburnt it," by which time I really didn't know what to do. As I say, I can't remember all she said, but that was the gist of it. So I said, "All right." She said, "Oh, you can make some excuse. You mustn't go. He'll be in your dressing room if you go," which was absolutely foreign to anything that Mr. Hardy would have done. I mean, to Dorcas or anything like that. There was no suggestion of anything like that. And I just couldn't understand. Well, I just had to sit down and make a lame excuse. All I could think about was that I hadn't given enough thought, and I hadn't realised how difficult it would be to leave my husband and child and home and so on. And I wrote the same to Thomas as I did to Mr. Harrison, you see. Julie got letters, and I got his letter, which is very, very precious. There's so many things I don't know even now. And I was hoping, after Michael Milgate and the professor with whom he's working they've written 7 novels, 7 volumes of the letters of Thomas Hardy, you see, I was hoping I would learn more, perhaps when Sybil Thorndike died. But there's nothing, and to this day I can't find out. And Michael Milgate, who I think is the best of the biographers, and I've read them all, of course, and met them all as far as that could. I never shall know just what happened then.
Did you ever see Mr. Hardy again after that?
Not after that lunch. You see, Mr. Harrison had come from London to talk it over, and we read the parts and so on. Then he was going back to London by train, of course, and he left. And then I thought it was time for me to go. Who else was there? Cockerell. Later became Sir Sidney Cochrane.
So that was the last time you saw...
Oh, then Thomas said, I'll see you down to your car, which I'd left outside. There's a short drive there. So we walked together and we were talking about going away, you see, and should I like it? And then in one sentence he said, well, you will create Tess in England, Tess as I knew her. And then he said, I'm not quite sure, I rather wish you would be our Wessex actress here. And several times he more or less said that roughly again. I wasn't quite sure. But just at the very last minute, he shook hands. He said, if anybody asks you if you ever knew Thomas Hardy, say yes, he was my friend. Little did I know that I'd never see him again, which I never did. It's quite like a Hardy story itself, really. And it was the last I saw, because it was the very Monday following, that was a Friday in January. I never saw him again, you see. And he has written Your Affectionate Friend in a volume of Tess. So if he said that, I can say that he was. But I can't say that we... Yes, we were friends, but then he was friendly, and we all liked him. He enjoyed rehearsals, enjoyed the plays, and helped with them, and so on.